Hello, let's look at inventions in a little bit more detail. I've mentioned in class that an invention is actually a mosaic of canons. And so what I've done here on this Bartók invention is draw loops around each of the canons. The piece begins with canon at the octave at a time interval of 2 beats. What that means is the subject is imitated exactly by the second voice an octave lower, starting 2 beats later. So that is an exact canon at the octave. For the next canon of the piece, Bartók states the subject again, and it's answered by the second voice, not an octave lower, but this time a sixth lower. And that's what you should do in your invention. The second canon is supposed to happen at a different musical interval than the first one. So first we had an octave, like that, and in the second canon, the first voice states the subject at the original pitch level, but the second voice comes in higher than it did before, so the musical interval between the first and second voice is only a sixth. That's very important to give the piece variety. You'll also notice that Bartók has made a rhythmic change to the subject. He stretched the first note out, so it's not just an eighth note now, but it is a beat and a half long, and he stretched another note a little bit later in the subject. However, the second voice imitates this exactly. It's a sixth lower, but other than that, the rhythm and the shape and the intervals of what the second voice plays are exactly the same as what the first voice is playing. And we can also see the time interval is tightened up, where in the first canon the voices were 2 beats apart. In the second canon, the voices are 1 beat apart. Okay, so here's a loop around the third canon. And we don't hear these loops, really. As the piece is going along, we hear an unbroken flow of counterpoint. Although, it is nice to hear the entrance of the subject. Our ears kind of prick up when we hear this, when we hear that sequence of pitches. All right, for the third canon, we can see Bartók has inverted the subject. The subject now goes, and he's added a little chromatic note to the subject, developing the subject a little bit as time goes on. But the answer in this canon, the second voice imitates faithfully what the first voice does, and the addition that he made in the first voice also happens in the second voice. So this is an exact copy of what the first voice does, with one tiny little addition of an eighth note at the end, but it's quite subtle. And the point I want to make is these canons are all quite strict throughout Bartók's invention. This is the first place where they're not an exact imitation. However, we do get variety this way. The subject starts on A, and the answer starts on G, a ninth below. So now we have canon at the major ninth, and separated rhythmically by 1 beat, but it's still a faithful canon. So at this point we've had 1, 2, 3 canons. Now we'll go on, and another canon begins here, and you can see this loop continues over there into the third system. So for this canon, the subject is back to its original contour. It's not inverted anymore. But what Bartók has done, and I've notated it right here, is he's fragmented the subject where it began. Now he has just the first 4 notes being repeated in a sequence. And that's imitated by the second voice, an octave lower, and a beat and a half later. This is the first time he's brought the subject in on a half beat. Some of you did this in your Invention chart, so I know you can do it. So here's the entrance of the first voice, entrance of the second voice, and intervallically, it's a completely faithful canon at the octave. I do see that where he stretches this F flat out to a full beat here, tied across the bar line, here it's a beat and a half. So the second voice is progressively getting a half beat farther behind, but that's still a very subtle thing, and it's basically a very faithful canon because the intervals and the notes are all exactly the same. Okay, here's our 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, sixth canon, and once again we see some intervallic stretching, but it is exactly the same. So this is a perfectly faithful canon at the octave. The next canon is the one where things break down a little bit. You see he starts putting some rests in. This is getting near the end of the piece, and so he's having a little loss of momentum only to regain it in the next canon. And this right here, notice there's no loop around this bit. This is his one measure or so of not canonic writing in the whole piece. All right, so here's a canon that pits the original motive in its original form, an original pitch level, against an inversion starting an octave lower. So the upper voice and the lower voice, but rhythmically it's a faithful canon. However, he does put a little tied-in pickup note just to make the rhythm a little bit less square. So he ties an extra extension onto the beginning, but after that it's a perfectly faithful canon at the octave and one beat with original form against inversion. From then on we have just two more perfectly faithful canons. This is original against inversion at a musical interval of a ninth, time interval of one beat, and it ends with musical interval of a perfect 11th and interval of one beat. So what I want you to see is how faithful this writing is. Without these loops, it can be hard to see that the subject is actually being imitated exactly almost all the time, just a beat or two or a beat and a half later and at some interval behind the upper voice. Here's a student canon by a former student named Andrea Campos, and we can have a look at it and see if she's using the techniques that Bartók used and following the recipe for an invention that you have in your assignment. So here's her subject. And as I did before, I've drawn loops around all of her canons, and we can see the first canon is at a time interval of 2 beats and at a musical interval of an octave. I've circled the first note so we can quickly measure from the C up to middle C, see the musical interval of an octave. This canon came from her chart. It works very well and gets us through the first 2 measures. Now, the recipe says we have to have a canon at a different musical interval for the second canon. After the subject has been stated at the octave, we've already heard it twice, something has to change. So the musical interval we have here is the subject now starts a minor third higher, okay, so that brings some color variety, and the answer is still at the original pitch level. So this is a canon from C up to E flat measures at the minor 10th, and she's also tightened up the time interval to canon at the 1 beat rhythmically instead of at the 2 beats. So the canon proceeds perfectly faithfully, which is great. You can see this note here is a beat and a half long. It's answering this one here, which is a beat and a half long, and then 3/8 notes and a half note. Here are the 3/8 notes, and then this note responds to that one. Okay, third canon. The musical interval remains at the minor 10th, However, the pitch level of the subject is new. So instead of starting on C or E flat, now the subject is starting on A, and the answer to it goes back to being 2 beats later, starting on C. So variety is achieved that way. This canon goes on faithfully up until here. So right here, the music, you can see, has a different shape. It's an inversion, and the answer is upside down. So subject and answer both in inversion, time interval of 2 beats, but still a perfectly faithful canon. Now this bit of it happens to be at the major ninth. The subject starts in the lower voice on A, upper voice on a B. Okay, here, after a measure of that, we realize that the upper voice is continuing the subject in inversion. The lower voice is fragmenting the subject to make counterpoint against the upper voice. So down here, halfway through the piece, we're starting to get a little bit more free techniques. But it's still a faithful representation of the subject, now in inversion, but a different pitch level, so you get a canon of a 7th with the upper voice instead of the 9th that we started at. Okay, so that canon finishes, and there's a little bit of an interlude here. One voice has a statement by itself, and then we move on with another canon. We're back to canon at the octave and 1 beat apart, and then the final canon on this page is the original versus the inversion at an octave apart. You can listen to this canon and the Bartók one as well by going back to a video from when I made the assignment. You can actually hear this. And if I had one criticism of this invention, it would be that there's not enough fragmenting of the subject. Actually, Bartók fragments quite a bit more than Andrea Campos does, and we can kind of get tired of hearing the subject played in entirety every time. You can even see the loops are a little bit extra long here because every time the subject comes in, we hear the whole thing, and there's a danger of that becoming a little predictable. So those are some ideas about how an invention goes together. I hope that's helpful.